Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that. It kicks off our theme for Unit 3, Colonial Discontent, and hopefully you feel like you understand a lot of what was being said and what we're about to learn, because this is designed to be a review for you to help you get ready for your test, or to help those of you that were absent to catch up on all your notes. And anyway, I hope you enjoy. Um, Again, this unit is our third unit and takes place after the colonial fight for the French and Indian War that the British won and drove the French off, and leads to all the issues that create a poor relationship to lead to our American Revolution. After the French and Indian War, the King of Parliament, they realized that they needed to strengthen the control that they had over their colonial empire. What they realized is that through the many years of salutary neglect, that most of the colonists in America feel like they are not Englishmen anymore and are becoming more and more independent and autonomous in their nature, and therefore the English need to respond to that if they're truly going to control a colony that's 3,000 miles away. The action and reaction series of events that follow, which have been the theme of this entire unit, will end up leading to the biggest event of our heritage, and that would be the American Revolution. Our story begins with the actions by the King and Parliament to tighten control in America, and we emphasize this at the end of the French and Indian War, how the French controlled predominantly this region out into this area right here, and when the French lost, they lost control of that. And so the Americans, believing that they had helped the British win that war, decided they wanted to go out into this area as well, and that is where a lot of the issues came from. The Proclamation of 1763 was the King's first attempt at controlling the colonists, and he wanted to make sure that they stayed east of the Appalachian Mountains. No colonists were allowed to go into Indian Territory because that would mean that he would have to pay for that, and he didn't want to do that to protect them. It didn't matter though, some still end up going west, and the King decides to station troops all throughout the frontier forts in order to keep the Americans in check. And so he, wants to make sure that he can do that, and he has to afford it, so he has to pay for it, which means he has to tax the colonies. Now, they've never had internal taxes in the American colonies. Parliament has always done the external taxes, like the Navigation Act and whatnot, but now all of a sudden the taxes that were normally left to the colonial assemblies to create have been taken over by the British Parliament and the King. And one of the first taxes that they use is something small and minimal. It's called the Sugar Act, and it's a tax on foreign molasses and sugar, and it affects a few people, and all of a sudden Americans start realizing that they're not in as much control as they'd like. The next act that the King decides to pass in order to make more money to help pay for the war and help pay for the frontier defense, and pretty much help keep in line the colonists, is the Stamp Act. And he places a tax on certain items that were, during that time, to be stamped. Pretty much all legal commercial documents had to carry a taxed stamp. Newspapers, playing cards, even dice. So this one affected almost everybody. And anytime you affect a large group of people, they're going to have a problem. And so within the structure of this problem, the Americans start to unify and come together a little bit. One group in particular finally comes together, much to the pleasure of Ben Franklin, who tried to get everyone to follow the political cartoon that I have in the background with the Albany Plan. He finally gets to have people come together in New York at the first Stamp Act Congress. And the colonies will meet, 9 of the 13 colonies, to show their unity for the first time, like I said, and they agree to boycott all British and imported goods. And this was a big deal. This was a first step in the right direction. And the Stamp Act Congress was going to be the beginning stages of American leaders unifying to fight a common foe. The colonial discontent would continue with the idea that in reality, taxation without representation is the main issue. That is the main problem. They are not represented in the Houses of Parliament. Parliament's made up of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the Americans feel like they should be British in every way. They should be British citizens with natural rights that are guaranteed to them and given to them, and they're not getting that kind of treatment, so that's what they're fighting for. They decide to boycott as well. And within the process of boycotting, they all agree at the Stamp Act Congress to have a non-importation agreement, which means they're not going to buy British-made goods. Now, this is a big deal because everything is British-made. America is only allowed to have raw materials that they ship out of the country. And so that obviously is going to affect the king's pocketbook. There's also a group of women in the colonies who want to rise up as well, and the Daughters of Liberty, they come together and they start to spin and knit American cloth so that they can make their own clothes. Again, manufacturing is illegal in the colonies. The only manufacturing that can be done is in the British factories. Patrick Henry is one of those people that kind of stands out to us. He was a part of the group that met at the Virginia House of Burgesses, and they all agreed that what the king was doing was unjust, and that they didn't have a voice in Parliament, that they should have some freedoms that they weren't being given. And so they called for the Virginia Resolves, which spoke out essentially against the king. And Patrick Henry will be one of those fiery, radical, revolutionary leaders who eventually will give the famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." This group in particular we've spent a lot of time with and talked a lot about. This political cartoon is something that you need to be aware of and remember and think about, as it shows one group in particular with the most of the discontented Americans displaying that dissatisfaction with the king, and they are known as the Sons of Liberty. And we've talked about them and emphasized them throughout this class, but they are created by Sam Adams, and he urged the colonists to resist all British control. Oftentimes, they were angry about lots of different things, but when they were angry about the Stamp Act, they burned piles of stamps. They abused the collectors that would come around and collect taxes in the name of the king. They used intimidation and often violence to get their message across. And so they were seen as pretty much a very raucous crowd. They would rabble up anybody they could get going. They would try to fire people up. And we saw that in the Sam Adams or John Adams video with the first one I showed you from the Boston Massacre. And we emphasized the idea of the Sons of Liberty doing things like tarring and feathering, and ultimately they were connected. Sam organizes the committees of correspondence to communicate all throughout the colonies the discontent of what was going on with these taxation issues. Now, with all this kind of discontent, the king is going to probably require that there be some sort of soldiers or somebody around to enact these things. And so the British taxation that comes during this time period is immense. They passed the Townshend Acts, which suspended, along with New York's assemblies, a lot of colonial assemblies. They taxed imported goods before they reached the stores. And then, not only that, the Americans, with all this discontent and all these leaders causing all these problems, they decided that smuggling was a big issue. And so the King George III, and Parliament decided that they would allow writs of assistance. And those are unlawful searches and seizures, and they were looking for smugglers, and they could pretty much check anybody. And so this is, we don't call it writs of assistance today, we call it search warrants. But obviously in our society today, they're made legal by due process of law. Well, the Americans didn't have a due process, and that was what they were fighting for. That was the idea, that was the things that they wanted. They wanted to have those freedoms guaranteed to them. So the king is having issues, so he decides to pass the Quartering Act, and his issues are with all the people that are causing grief. And the Quartering Act is designed around soldiers are to be kept and allowed to live in the homes of the citizenry.